My name is Malcolm, and for most of my adult life, I was the man who said yes. Not out of weakness, not because I lacked a spine, but because that was how I understood love, quiet, steady, and unconditional. I believed that being present, even when you weren't wanted, was a form of strength. But looking back, I realized that sometimes silence isn't noble. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own erasure. Alyssa was 7 when she made the decision. Her mother, Renee, had remarried, and they had a newer, bigger house with a pool and a man named Leonard who smelled like money and smoked cigars like he thought it made him look wise. Alyssa liked him. He gave her rides in his convertible and called her princess. I was still in the same 2-bedroom bungalow where we used to build forts from couch cushions and eat cereal for dinner when we both had the flu. But I said yes. When she sat on my lap one Sunday night and said she wanted to live with Mommy and Leonard because their house has a better backyard, I nodded. I smiled. I said yes. Then I drove her over with her favorite stuffed bear and a suitcase she packed herself. When she walked into their house and didn't look back, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, the engine running and my hands frozen on the wheel. I didn't cry. I just said yes to the space she left behind. The calls came later. When she was older, in college. Usually late, sometimes slurred. Dad, I know it's late, but can you send me 500? Or, Dad, my car broke down. Again, I don't know what to do. And even once, Dad, I think I'm pregnant. I never said no. I'd get out of bed, pull up my bank app, and send what I could. I wasn't wealthy. I fixed garage doors and built fences and sometimes delivered groceries when money got tight. But every time she asked, I said yes. Because that's what you do for your kids, right? You show up, even when they don't remember how many times you've already done it. And then came the wedding. She called me on a Thursday evening. I remember I had just come in from mowing the lawn. My shirt was still damp with sweat, and the house smelled like cut grass and faint mildew. She didn't start with hello or how are you, just even like she'd been rehearsing. So Leonard's walking me down the aisle. I stood there in the kitchen, holding the receiver like it might burn me. What? He's been there for me through everything, Dad. It just makes sense. I want you there, obviously. But Leonard's going to give me away. It was like being uninvited without being told to stay home. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I could have argued. I could have reminded her of the years I took her to every school play, the nights I stayed up holding her through stomach flus and nightmares, the time I sold my watch to pay for her braces. But all I said was, okay. And then, a little quieter, yes. That was my role, ghost with a wallet. I bought the shoes she wore that day, paid for half the photographer bill, and when I showed up to the ceremony, I stood in the 4th row, not the first. Watched a man who came into her life after the hard part walk her to the altar like he'd carried every memory. He wore a boutonniere I paid for. And when they asked who gave her away, he said, I do, like it was a transaction he'd earned. I smiled. I clapped. I hugged strangers and avoided the punch because I didn't trust myself not to throw it. After the ceremony, someone's cousin asked if I was the bride's uncle. I didn't correct her. Just nodded. Just said yes. I've heard people say that being a parent means giving without expecting anything in return. And I believe that. Still do, in some small way. But there's a difference between loving without condition and accepting invisibility as your identity. When Alyssa announced her pregnancy, she didn't call me first. Renee posted it on Facebook with a picture of Leonard holding the ultrasound like he was some proud doctor. I found out because my neighbor Doris, sweet but nosy, tagged me in the comments. Congrats, Grandpa, the caption read. I didn't respond. I drove to the store and bought a wooden cradle kit. It sat in my garage for 3 months, untouched. I wasn't sure if they'd want anything from me. Then came the baby shower. Alyssa called and said she wanted to have it at my house. Said it felt more homey, which I found ironic. But again, I said yes. Repainted the porch. Bought decorations. Learned how to use a cake printer just to design frosting with the baby's name. I cleaned every crevice of that old bungalow until it gleamed. Because somewhere, deep down, a child in me still hoped this time would be different. That maybe this would be the moment she looked at me like a father again. Not an accessory, not an extra. But that's not how it works when you're the man who always says yes. People stop hearing you. They stop seeing you. You become furniture, expected, unmoving, useful until you're in the way. I didn't know it then, but that baby shower would be my final lesson. The final receipt in a long ledger of sacrifices never tallied. I had lived my whole life thinking that love was measured by presence, that if you just kept showing up, they'd remember, they'd see. But the truth is, being present doesn't matter to people who already decided you're part of the background. And in that chapter of my life, I was nothing but the man who said yes, soft, invisible, and fading. The day of the baby shower arrived like any other, too warm for early spring, the sky hanging low and white like it hadn't made up its mind. I had been up since dawn. The porch paint had barely dried. The rented tables, white with lace-trimmed cloths, lined the yard. I'd measured them myself, spacing everything evenly. A soft breeze lifted the baby blue balloons I'd tied to the banister, and the scent of lavender-scented cleaning spray still lingered from the last wipe of the kitchen counter. I had even ironed my shirt, an old white one I saved for holidays, and tucked it into clean jeans. If nothing else, I could look like a man who was trying. I watched people pour in friends I didn't recognize, some relatives I hadn't seen since Alyssa was in braces. Renee was there, of course, still with that same tone of effortless superiority in her voice, as if the way she clinked her wine glass should impress everyone. Leonard stood next to her in a pastel blue blazer, smiling like this whole event had sprung from his wallet and not mine. He took credit easily, like breathing. Alyssa moved through the house like a hostess on autopilot, cheeks glowing, hands fluttering. She looked beautiful, radiant, even. She'd always had that glow, ever since she was a kid. Even now, watching her greet everyone with a hug and a soft joke, I felt proud. But I also felt like a man standing outside his own window, watching a life play out that he built but wasn't invited to live in. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, near the back door, pretending to refill pitchers of lemonade and sparkling cider. People passed by, said thanks without looking me in the eye. Occasionally someone would ask where the bathroom was, or if I had any tape. That was the extent of my usefulness, directions, and supplies. It was about 2 hours in when Alyssa clinked her glass with a spoon and asked everyone to quiet down. She was standing in front of the fireplace, the banner I had hand-stitched spelling out, "Welcome Baby Elise" above her. I smiled at that. She'd kept the name a secret from me, and now, somehow, it didn't feel like mine to celebrate. She took a breath, one hand on her small round belly, and looked around the room like it was hers to command. "I just want to say thank you," she began. "To everyone who came, and to the man who made all this possible." For a split second, less than that, really, my heart reached forward like a dog thinking it had heard its name. Maybe, just maybe she'd seen the hours I'd spent sewing that damn banner. The paint under my nails. The way I stayed up late baking 4 batches of red velvet cupcakes because she said she liked homemade. "This man," she said, turning with a full smile, "has been my rock, my protector, my father in all the ways that count." She raised her glass toward Leonard, and the room erupted into applause. I didn't even register it at first. I just stared. No one noticed. No one turned to see if I was okay, if I was even still standing there. Because I wasn't part of the scene. I was part of the house. Fixtures don't get to feel things. "The only real grandfather my daughter will ever know," she added. That part landed differently. It sliced clean. My legs didn't carry me away right away. I stood there, near the counter, my hands damp with dishwater from wiping something earlier. Leonard gave a small nod of acknowledgement, like he'd just won a prize he always knew was his. And Alyssa, she didn't even glance my way. Not even a flicker of her eyes. Just turned and toasted and laughed with her mother. I backed up slowly, unnoticed. The hallway was dimmer than I remembered, quiet compared to the joyful hum in the living room. My hand brushed the edge of the stairwell as I passed it, something I hadn't done in years. I ended up in the guest room, her old room once. The one with the chipped dresser and star stickers still faintly glowing on the ceiling. I closed the door behind me and stood in the dark. There was no music, no voice, just the faint thump of footsteps and laughter from down the hall. I walked to the bed and sat at the edge, staring at the wall, at the faint outline where her old corkboard used to hang. There were still tiny pinholes in the paint. I used to stand here on Sunday nights, holding her tiny pink backpack while she brushed her teeth. I used to sit on this same bed and read her Goodnight Moon, and she'd insist I leave the door cracked open so the hallway light would reach the stars on her ceiling. And now she toasted another man like I never existed. It wasn't just a moment of hurt. It was a moment of realization. The kind that reshapes things inside you. The kind that finally names what you've been denying for too long. She had made her choice. She had written her story. And in that story, I was not the hero. I wasn't even a character. I was a prop. The dependable thing that always showed up but never got mentioned in the credits. That was the night the grief changed. It wasn't just about being left out. It was about knowing I had said yes so many times that I'd given her permission to forget I mattered. When the clinking of glasses resumed and the guests cheered for someone opening pastel-wrapped gifts, I didn't go back. I stayed there in that dim room and listened. The sound wasn't quiet. It was absence shaped like celebration. And somehow, it was louder than any scream I could have made. And still, I didn't cry. I just sat. Because maybe that's what men like me do. We sit in the dark places no one bothers to check. And we let go, one piece at a time. No one noticed when I stepped away. Not a soul. The sound of laughter kept rolling through the house like a wave that had never learned how to stop. I moved through the hallway like a ghost who'd once lived there. My footsteps were soft on the hardwood floor, each one somehow heavier than the last. I didn't announce where I was going. I didn't have to. I wasn't the kind of presence people expected to keep track of. The guest room still had her old bed. I had kept it, not because I expected her to come back, but because I couldn't bring myself to remove the one space that had once held her joy. The bedspread was new, something she'd picked when she moved back and during her third trimester, but the frame was the same. I remembered tightening the bolts myself when she was 8, after she tried to jump on it like a trampoline and knocked one side loose. The mattress had never quite stopped creaking in that corner. Even now, when I sat down on the edge of it, I heard the faint groan of memory. The lights were off. I didn't turn them on. I didn't want the brightness. I didn't want the full view. I sat in the quiet, letting the dark fill in the edges of the room around me like ink bleeding through old paper. My elbows rested on my knees, my hands clasped in front of me. I must have looked like a man waiting for something, but there was nothing coming. When she was little, she used to tape paper stars to the ceiling, cheap little cutouts she'd colored with markers. Some were still faintly there, ghosts of glue and faded construction paper. I remember how she'd beg me to leave the door cracked open just enough so the light from the hallway spilled onto the ceiling, illuminating her imaginary constellations. "It keeps the monsters away," she'd say. I never argued. I'd kneel beside her bed, tuck the blanket around her like I was wrapping a secret, and whisper, "No monsters here. You're safe." I don't know when that stopped being enough. I don't know the exact year she stopped asking for stars or stopped calling me her safe place. Maybe it was when I missed a school play because of a job that ran late. Maybe it was the time I said no to a new phone because the rent was due. Or maybe it was nothing at all. Just the slow drip of distance that seeps in when someone else offers more glitter, more sparkle, more attention. Leonard had money. He had time. He had charm. But he didn't have her first lost tooth. He didn't sleep in the hospital chair when she broke her arm falling off the jungle gym in 3rd grade. He didn't sit outside her middle school in the pouring rain because she forgot her umbrella and didn't want anyone to see her dad with a plastic grocery bag over his head. But she chose him anyway. I leaned back against the headboard, the wood pressing cold against my shoulders. A box of diapers sat in the corner, a folded baby blanket with ducks on it, all signs of a new life beginning. But the silence that wrapped around me wasn't full of promise. It was full of absence, and that absence didn't feel accidental. It felt chosen, and that's what hurt the most. It's one thing to be forgotten. It's another thing to be replaced. I tried to trace back when things began to shift. Maybe when she was 12 and asked to go on that summer trip with Renee instead of staying with me. Or when she started calling less in college, and her voice took on a polite distance, like I was a nice man she was grateful for but not really tethered to anymore. I made excuses. She's busy. She's growing. She's finding her place. But what I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that she was also building a version of her story where I was just a footnote. And I helped write it. Every time I said yes without asking for anything in return. Every time I showed up quietly and left before the photos. Every time I swallowed her to make her feel comfortable. I didn't teach her to see me. I taught her I would always accept being unseen. I looked over at the closet. The door was ajar. Inside were old picture frames she never hung up. One of them still had a photo of us fishing at Lake Monroe when she was 5, her pigtails lopsided, her smile gap-toothed and pure. I reached for it without thinking, brushing dust off the glass. For a brief moment, the version of her that loved me without condition looked back. Where did that girl go? I wanted to believe she was still in there somewhere. That the woman downstairs, raising glasses to another man, was just confused or hurting or misled. But I couldn't afford that fantasy anymore. Not after today. Not after hearing her toast the man she wished had raised her. She wasn't confused. She had chosen her version of the truth. And it didn't include me. The room didn't feel like hers anymore. It didn't even feel like a room. It felt like a tomb for every moment I thought mattered. And the silence, it wasn't gentle. It was suffocating. Not empty, but loud with everything that would never be said. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because the tears just wouldn't come. My body felt locked in place, as if weeping would somehow imply I still had hope. I didn't. Not anymore. I wasn't mourning the past. I was finally admitting it was over. She had her father. She said it out loud. She meant it. And I was done trying to win a role that I'd already been written out of. I set the photo down, face down this time. Stood up slowly. My knees popped in protest, age reminding me of its presence. I opened the door, the hallway light slicing across the floor like a reminder that the world kept spinning even when you stopped caring. I didn't go back to the party. I went outside, to the old workbench in the garage, and picked up a piece of sandpaper. My hands needed something to do, because my heart had finally stopped trying to reach for a daughter who had already walked away. The house was still. That eerie kind of still where even the walls seemed tired. The front door had barely clicked shut behind the last guest when I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, alone again, staring at confetti bits and half-empty paper cups left on the coffee table like forgotten tokens from a party I was never really part of. The air still carried the scent of baby lotion and vanilla cake, sweet and nauseating. I stood there with my hands at my sides, unsure what to do first, clean up or just collapse. I chose cleaning. Of course I did. It was muscle memory at this point. I moved through the room picking up plates, tossing them into a black trash bag that rustled too loudly in the silence. Every scrape of a fork, every clink of glass, felt like punctuation marks in a sentence I hadn't wanted to write. But I kept going. The tablecloth came off next, stained with punch and chocolate. I folded it, not because I needed to save it, but because it felt wrong to crumple something that still looked like it was trying to hold itself together. That's what I'd been doing for years, folding pain neatly, packing it away where no one had to see it. I had been the man who stayed behind after the lights went out, after the candles were blown and the guests took their goodie bags and praise with them. The one who never asked for credit. The one who always locked the door after everyone else went to bed. But something was different now. Something small and sharp inside me had finally broken loose, and no amount of folding or swallowing was going to push it back down. I moved to the kitchen next. The dishes were already piled up, even though they were mostly plastic. Still, I washed a few things out of habit, her favorite mug, the one with the chip at the rim she never seemed to notice. The sponge in my hand slowed as I stared out the kitchen window. The night was black, stars hidden behind a curtain of clouds. The porch light cast a dull glow over the lawn I had mowed just the day before. It had looked so perfect this morning. Every blade trimmed, every decoration set up just right. And for what? So I could stand beside the fridge like a stranger while my daughter toasted the man she believed had fathered her better than I ever could? I turned away from the window, grabbed a dish rag, and wiped my hands dry. That's when I noticed the drawer slightly open. Top left corner. The one where I kept odd tools, batteries, and forgotten keys. Something white peeked out. A corner of a blank eviction notice I had printed months ago when money got tight and I almost considered renting out the extra room. I had forgotten it was even there. But now it stared back at me like an unopened door. I pulled it out, unfolded the sheet. The spaces were still blank. No names. No dates. Just the cold, structured language of removal. I stood there holding it, my thumb. Brushing across the empty line meant for tenant name. That word stuck in my throat like a bone. Tenant. That's what she'd become, hadn't she? She wasn't my little girl anymore. She wasn't family in the way I had once believed. Woven into every decision, every heartbeat. No, she lived here. She occupied space. But she didn't belong to me, not emotionally, not spiritually, not in the ways that matter. And the more I looked at that form, the more I realized what it symbolized. Not punishment. Not vengeance. But clarity. For the first time in years, I saw it all for what it really was. I had turned this house into a sanctuary for someone who only remembered it when she needed shelter. I had given away every square foot of this place, emotionally and literally, and I was the only one who ever paid for it. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled a pen from the drawer, and filled in her name. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate either. Letter by letter, I wrote, Alyssa Renee Holloway. My handwriting wobbled a bit, but I didn't care. When I reached the bottom and signed my name, I didn't feel guilt. I felt weight sliding off my chest in increments. When I finished, I slipped the form into a plain envelope. No note. No love, Dad scrawled at the bottom. Just her name on the front. I left it on the hallway table, right next to the diaper tower someone had brought in, wrapped in pink ribbons and bows that matched the gift tags. It looked ridiculous now, garish against the plain white of the envelope beside it. One held future plans, joy, new life. The other held my boundary. I stood there looking at the two. The contrast didn't shake me. It settled me. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clean. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I stayed in the living room, not out of sadness, but because I didn't want to go through the motions of pretending everything was still normal. I made a small cot out of the couch cushions and lay there, the house silent around me. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The ceiling fan spun above me, slow, steady, like a clock with nowhere to be. I thought of Alyssa's first steps, her tiny feet slapping against the hardwood as she barreled toward me, laughing. I remembered the time she painted the dog blue and told me it was because he wanted to be the sky. I remembered her hugs, tight and unself-conscious, and the way she'd fall asleep on my chest watching cartoons. And then I remembered her voice yesterday. This is the man I wish had raised me. Those words had cracked something, but they had also freed me. Because the truth was, I had been clinging to an illusion for far too long. An idea of fatherhood that only worked if both people showed up. I had shown up, again and again, but she had stopped. And now I was done chasing her shadow through the halls of a home she didn't want to see clearly. For the first time, I didn't feel like the man left behind. I felt like a man finally choosing to stand in his own house without apology. That night, I whispered one word into the dark, not to her, not to Leonard, not even to the version of me that kept saying yes. I whispered, enough, and for the first time in years, I meant it. Morning light slipped through the slats of the blinds like it was apologizing for showing up. I'd been awake for hours. I didn't sleep well, not because I was restless, but because I was finally still. Still in a way that felt earned, like someone who'd been carrying too many bags and finally dropped them all at once. I had no appetite, but I made coffee anyway. I stood by the window, sipping it slowly, watching a squirrel dart across the fence I had rebuilt last fall. For once, I wasn't waiting for anyone to wake up, to say thank you, to notice. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rattle of wind at the back door. Then I heard footsteps, soft, uneven, dragging like she hadn't really woken up yet. Alyssa. Her slippers scraped the floor, the way they always did when she was groggy. I didn't turn. I stayed facing the window, coffee warming my hands, the weight of what I had done last night settling around my shoulders like a wool coat I chose to wear. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask for coffee. She didn't even notice me at first. I could hear her breathing as she padded into the living room where the remnants of the baby shower still lingered like guests who'd overstayed their welcome. And then I heard it. That faint rustle of paper, the pause, the silence that stretches when someone reads something that changes the room. I didn't move. I heard her tear the envelope open. The rip was slow, almost reluctant. She read it once. Then again. The same way she'd once read birthday cards, just to be sure she hadn't missed anything hidden in the folds. But this wasn't a card. This wasn't love in disguise. Just a form. Just her name. Just a date. Her voice, when it finally came, was low. Barely more than breath. Fine. That one word hit harder than a scream. It didn't come with protest, not with confusion or tears or pleading. It came as a flat acceptance. A surrender she hadn't rehearsed, but had expected. She placed the notice down with a quiet that carried more weight than any argument ever could. I still hadn't turned to face her. She stood there, I imagine, by the pastel towers of diapers and the mountain of unopened baby books, looking at the piece of paper that told her her time here was over. That this place, this house she'd treated like a right, was no longer hers by default. I waited for her to say something else. To fight. To explain. To apologize. But she didn't. She walked away. I listened to the creak of the stairs as she climbed them, slow and measured. There was no rush, no panic. Just the weight of inevitability in every step. She knew. She had known this was coming. Maybe not when she clinked her glass and toasted Leonard, but certainly somewhere in her. Somewhere beneath the performance and the borrowed sentiment. She had to have felt it, that line she'd finally crossed. I finished my coffee, poured the rest down the sink. The grounds at the bottom slid out in a lazy spiral, dark and dense. I rinsed the mug and placed it carefully on the drying rack. Everything I did quietly, deliberately. There was no room for noise in the space between us now. Later, I heard her moving upstairs. The whir of drawers being opened, the shuffle of things being gathered. It wasn't hurried, but it wasn't slow either. Efficient, like someone going through the steps of a checklist. Maybe she was packing. Maybe she was just pretending to. I didn't check. I went outside to the porch and sat in the chair I'd painted just days earlier. The air had that crisp mid-morning scent, grass, faint dew, and something brittle like change. I listened to birdsong, distant and cheerful, like the world didn't care what happened behind closed doors. It occurred to me that I didn't know where she would go. Would she stay with Renee? Would Leonard make space in his curated world of order and ego? Maybe. Maybe not. It wasn't mine to solve anymore. She had called this house comfortable when she asked to stay here during her pregnancy. Not home, just comfortable. I hadn't noticed the difference back then. But now, every word she'd spoken in the past year sounded like a footnote to the real story she had already written. And me? I was done being the editor who cleaned up her margins. She came downstairs an hour later. Her face was blank, expressionless, but her eyes were ringed with the kind of tired that sits behind the bones. She held the baby monitor in one hand like a totem, a symbol of everything fragile and hopeful in her life, as if it might protect her from the truth sitting just behind that eviction notice. She didn't meet my eyes. Just walked through the kitchen, picked up a bottle of water from the fridge, and moved back toward the stairs like I wasn't even there. I wanted to say something. I almost did. A dozen things pressed against the back of my throat. I loved you. I tried. This hurts. But none of it mattered now. She wasn't listening, and I wasn't offering anymore. For the first time, I had no interest in wrapping my truth in comfort. I let the silence speak for me. She didn't cry. That's what struck me most. She didn't scream, didn't call me cruel or ungrateful. She just said fine. That was all. But that word was a key. It unlocked something. Not in her, in me. Because it was the first time I didn't rush to undo the discomfort. I didn't scramble to soften the edge. I didn't retreat into guilt or shame or some twisted version of parental duty. I stayed still. I let it sting. And then I let it pass. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up what the party had left behind. Banners came down. Leftover cake went into the trash. Wrapping paper into a large black bag, along with the hollow laughter that still echoed faintly from yesterday. By sundown, the house looked like nothing had happened. As if the baby shower, the toast, the heartbreak. It all belonged to some other version of reality. That night, I sat in the living room with a single lamp on and no television. I didn't need distraction. I needed space. Just space. To feel what I needed to feel. And I did. For the first time in years, I let myself feel it all, the grief, the shame, the release. It moved through me like a slow current, and when it was done, it left something behind. Stillness. A deep, unwavering stillness. I wasn't reaching anymore. I wasn't bending. I wasn't saying yes. And for the first time in forever, that felt like freedom. The nursery was the first to go. It had once been the brightest room in the house, full of light and soft colors. Now, in the quiet after everything, it felt hollow, painted promises on walls that no longer meant anything. I stood in the doorway, the same doorway I had leaned against the day she asked if she could convert the space. It'll just be temporary, she said, until we get on our feet. I remember nodding. I remember saying yes. There were ducklings on the curtains, a mobile hanging from the ceiling that played some tinny lullaby when you wound the key in the back. I had helped install the crib, tightened each screw by hand while Alyssa told me how this baby would change everything. I remember her smiling in a way I hadn't seen since she was young. That smile stayed with me for weeks, maybe because it felt like a door had finally creaked open again. A chance. A sliver of being needed. But now, that crib was the first thing I dismantled. My hands moved slower than usual. Not out of hesitation, just weariness. The kind that lives deep in the joints. The mobile came down next, its clouds and stars dangling by threads, spinning slightly from the movement in the room. I wound it one last time, just to hear the tune. It played for about 20 seconds before fading into silence, the kind that wraps around your chest and doesn't let go. I boxed the onesies next. So many of them. Tiny clothes with phrases like Grandma's Girl and Future Astronaut. None said Grandpa's favorite. That detail wasn't lost on me. I folded them gently anyway, placing them in neat stacks, each one a reminder of a future I had imagined myself in but was now uninvited from. Then came the books. Board books, cloth books, bright pages filled with colors and smiling animals. One of them still had my handwriting on the inside cover. To Baby Elise, from Grandpa Malcolm. That one I kept. Not for her. For me. Maybe out of spite. Maybe out of longing. It didn't matter. I set it aside while the rest went into the bin. The room emptied quickly. It was amazing, really, how fast something that took months to fill could be cleared in less than an hour. By the time I reached the bottom of the toy chest, all that was left were the echoes of moments that never got to happen, midnight feedings, sleepy giggles, first words. They had existed in my mind like snapshots, blurry and imagined, but precious just the same. Then I saw them, tucked at the back of the shelf behind the diapers. Drawings. Alyssa's drawings. Crayon portraits, faded from time and sun, curled at the edges. One was of me. A stick figure version, sure, but unmistakably me, complete with a crooked crown on my head and the words "My King" written in shaky, misspelled handwriting. I sat down on the floor without thinking, holding it in both hands. I remembered the day she gave it to me. She was 5. I had just fixed the leaky pipe under the sink, and she said I was like a hero, but with tools. I traced the lines of that old crown, and for a second, I felt like that man again, the one she used to look up to without question, without conditions. But that man didn't exist anymore. Not to her. Not in the way that mattered. I stood up slowly and walked to the fireplace. I didn't do it with anger. I didn't even feel rage. What I felt was deeper. Grief, yes, but not the sharp kind. This grief was old, exhausted, like a song that had played too many times and finally lost its melody. I fed the drawings in one by one. The paper curled immediately, blackening at the corners before bursting into orange-edged flames. I didn't look away. I watched each image disappear, dissolving into smoke and ash. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere between the eviction notice and the silence of her single word. Fine. There were a few more Mother's Day cards from when she was 8 or 9. One where she had drawn our little house, and inside it, 2 smiling faces, her and me. No Leonard. No Renee. Just us. I burned them, too. Not out of hate. Not to forget. But because clinging to those pieces was like trying to keep a balloon from floating away using just your breath. Sooner or later, you run out of air. The flames whispered as they devoured everything, licking the past clean. The ashes gathered quietly in the grate, no drama, no ceremony. Just the quiet, unspoken understanding between a father and his own surrender. I cleaned the fireplace once the last ember faded, brushed the ashes into a small metal pail. I didn't scatter them. I didn't keep them. I just placed the pail under the sink. Maybe someday I'd throw them into the garden. Or maybe I'd forget they were even there. Either way, they no longer carried weight. When I walked back through the hallway, the house felt different. Not lighter. Just more mine. As though I had made space, not for someone else, but for myself. The walls no longer carried the echoes of her footsteps or the promise of a baby's cry. They were just walls. And for the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like truth. I passed by her old room again. The door was open, the bed unmade, a few bags by the dresser. She hadn't taken everything yet. I didn't care. Let her come and go as she pleased. But the room, like the nursery, had shifted. It was no longer a museum of the past. It was just a space waiting to become something else. I walked outside for air. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that made everything seem flatter, but not unfriendly. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the gutter. I stood on the porch, watching a neighbor walk his dog across the street. He nodded. I nodded back. I wasn't broken. Not anymore. I wasn't trying to piece together an old picture that no longer existed. I wasn't waiting for her to say the right thing. I wasn't hoping for redemption from a daughter who didn't see me. I was just here, breathing, still, and somehow, in that moment, that was enough. The days that followed were quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels lonely, but the kind that settles around your bones and tells you that something has shifted. The gate had been squeaking for weeks. I fixed it. The step on the porch had started to bow. I replaced it. I repainted the trim around the windows, raked the leaves that had gathered like forgotten promises along the side of the garage, and for the first time in years, I did it all without expecting a thank you. Not from Alyssa. Not from anyone. This house had begun to feel like mine again, room by room, repair by repair. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost: peace. Until they came back. It was a Wednesday afternoon, cool enough to keep the windows cracked. I was in the backyard, trimming back the hydrangeas, when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The engine was too clean, the tires too quiet, Leonard's Lexus. I didn't look up right away. I knew who it was by the way the door shut, decisive, expensive. I waited, let the shears click once more in my hand before walking around the house. They were both standing there, Alyssa and Leonard. She wore that look she always wore when she didn't want to be here but couldn't help herself, arms folded, mouth tight. Leonard stood like a man who had practiced the art of being unbothered. One hand in his pocket, the other holding sunglasses he didn't need. His presence always felt like a pressurized room, too polished, too measured, too smug. I didn't say anything, just leaned against the porch railing and waited. Leonard was the first to speak, of course. "You can't just throw your own daughter out," he said, voice smooth, like a salesman closing a pitch. "That's not how family works." I tilted my head slightly, as if I hadn't heard him right. "No." He gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they think they've already won the argument. "No, Malcolm. You don't evict blood." Alyssa stood a little behind him, her eyes flicking around the porch, the steps, the yard, everywhere but me. I nodded slowly, rubbing my thumb along the grain of the wood rail. "Tell me something, Leonard. When she was 11 and wanted to go to that sleepaway camp, who sold his guitar to pay the deposit?" Leonard blinked, confused. "When she totaled her first car at 19, who drove 3 hours in the middle of the night to make sure she got home safe?" His mouth opened, but I wasn't done. "When she came home pregnant and scared, who gave her a room? Who paid for groceries? Who built her a crib she never used?" Silence. I stepped forward, just once, not angry, clear. "She made her choice," I said, voice low, steady. "She's an adult. A mother. She toasted you like I never existed, Leonard. And I took it. I swallowed it whole. But you don't get to come back here and pretend like this house still belongs to people who treat me like a stranger." Alyssa's lips parted then, just barely. But Leonard, of course, cut in. "This is about pride," he said. "About ego. You're punishing her for something you didn't like." I laughed, not loudly, just a single breath of disbelief. "No. This is about finally waking up. It's about understanding the difference between being needed and being used. She's not being punished. She's being released." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're the victim in all this?" I didn't flinch. "No. I think I've been the volunteer." That landed. His jaw clenched, and for a second, I saw the glint of something less polished behind his eyes, something irritated that his charm wasn't working. Alyssa finally spoke then. "Dad, please, can we not do this here?" I looked at her. Really looked. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just standing there like someone who thought this confrontation might change something. I shook my head slowly. "You called him the only real grandfather your daughter would ever have. You toasted him. You erased me, Alyssa, and I let you. I let you because I thought that was what love meant. But love isn't erasing yourself for someone who doesn't want to see you." She didn't respond. Her mouth opened, then closed. Leonard turned toward her. "Let's go," he said, low and irritated now. This was a waste of time. I stepped back, opened the screen door, and stood in the frame. "You're not welcome here anymore," I said. "Not like this." He scoffed. "You're not serious." But I didn't answer. I just let the screen door slam shut behind me. Inside, I heard the car doors slam, the engine purr to life, the tires whispering back down the driveway. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching the lights stretch through the blinds and pool across the floor like spilled gold. My hands were shaking, but not with fear or doubt. With release. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Sat at the table. Let the weight settle. There was no victory in that moment. No triumph. Just the sound of a man who had finally spoken the words he should have said years ago. She made her choice. And this time, so did I. They came back the next morning. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen that storm building in Alyssa's eyes yesterday, even as Leonard tried to handle it all with that artificial calm of his. I knew it wasn't over. Not with Alyssa. She's her mother's daughter. Never leaves a conversation if she doesn't get the last word. I just didn't expect the angle she came with. I was sitting in the workshop, smoothing the edge of a half-built cradle, the kind I used to dream of making for Elise before everything unraveled. The grain was soft pine, too soft for heavy hands, but gentle enough for something meant to hold new life. My fingers were steady. My thoughts were not. Then the knock came, 3 short raps, impatient, like the door owed her something. I set the sandpaper down and walked through the hallway, past the living room where the sunlight was cutting stripes across the floor. I opened the door, and there they were again. Alyssa stood in front this time, Leonard at her side like backup in a courtroom. Her arms were crossed. Her expression was steel, and her tone hit me before her words even did. "You're punishing my daughter," she said. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the words sink in like rain into dry earth. "No," I said. "I'm drawing a line. There's a difference. She needs stability," Alyssa continued. "She needs a home. You're taking that from her because of your pride." Pride. I said it like I was testing the word on my tongue for the first time. "You think this is about pride?" She stepped forward. "You're angry at me. Fine. But don't take it out on her. She's just a baby." Leonard didn't speak this time. He stood a step behind her, lips pressed together like a man who thought silence would make him seem righteous. I saw it for what it was, calculated distance so he could keep his hands clean. "You know what's funny?" I said, voice quiet. "You stand there and tell me I'm the villain now, the cold one, the one throwing people out. But for years, I've been the one you've erased, Alyssa. Slowly, quietly, death by 1,000 cuts. And I bled for you. I never complained. I never made you feel guilty. I just took it. One missed Father's Day at a time. One ignored voicemail at a time. One, Leonard is walking me down the aisle at a time." She blinked. Just once. But she didn't interrupt. "And you know why I did?" I continued. "Because I thought maybe if I just kept showing up, kept saying yes, one day you'd remember that I was the one who stayed. That maybe you'd turn and see me standing in the shadows of all your milestones. But you never did. And I finally realized. Standing in the kitchen the day of your baby shower, watching you toast the man you wish had raised you, that you never would." Leonard's jaw tightened, but I didn't care. I looked at her. Only her. "I'm not the villain in your story, Alyssa. I'm just the chapter you keep skipping." "You're being cruel," she said finally. "You're pushing me away." "No," I said. "I'm letting you go." The words landed heavy, and I watched her flinch, just slightly. Then her expression hardened again. "You think closing this door makes you strong? You think saying no now erases the years you spent pretending you were okay with everything?" "No," I said, stepping back into the threshold. "But it finally makes me honest." I didn't yell. I didn't raise my hands. I just looked her in the eyes and said the one thing I had been afraid to say for too long. "You're a mother now, Alyssa. You'll figure it out." She blinked again, this time slower. She wasn't expecting that. She wasn't expecting me not to break, not to bend. I think part of her still thought she could talk her way back in, or cry, or guilt me. But that part of me, the one that used to crumble every time she looked disappointed, was gone. Leonard shifted behind her, finally speaking. "You'll regret this." I met his eyes, calm and direct. "Maybe, but not today." Then I closed the door. There wasn't a slam. No dramatic finish. Just the quiet snick of the latch sliding into place, sealing my decision like a period at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. I didn't stand there and listen to them leave. I didn't need to. I turned around and walked back to the workshop. The cradle was still sitting there on the bench, half sanded, the edges still rough. I picked up the sandpaper again and went back to work. Not because I thought Elise would ever sleep in it. Not because I had hope, but because it was mine. Because it was something I started for love. And even if that love never found its way back to me, it didn't make the act of building any less true. I'm not the villain in her story anymore. Because I'm not even part of that story now. And for the first time in a long time, I think that's okay. She came back 3 days later. This time, there was no car pulling into the driveway like a threat. No Leonard standing beside her like he was about to deliver closing arguments in a courtroom. Just Alyssa, alone, quiet, different. I didn't hear her arrive. I only noticed when I glanced up from my workbench and saw her through the slatted window, standing on the porch, staring at the front door like it was the gate to something she no longer belonged to. I didn't move right away. My hands were still coated in sawdust, fingertips tingling from hours of sanding. I had been shaping the edges of the cradle again, smoothing the corners, giving it weight and symmetry and purpose. But the truth was, I wasn't building it for Elise anymore. I was building it for peace. My peace. She didn't knock. Instead, I heard the faint sound of the front door creaking open, just slightly, and then her voice, low, unsteady, not quite a whisper, not quite strong. I'm just picking up my things. No explanation. No apology. No confrontation. Just that. I wiped my hands with a towel, set the chisel down carefully, and stayed where I was. I didn't want to see her carry the boxes. I didn't want to make eye contact. I didn't want to have to pretend I didn't feel everything she wouldn't say. So I remained in the workshop, surrounded by the scent of pine, varnish, and the steady, deliberate rhythm of a man reclaiming silence. I heard her footsteps move through the house. Not fast. Not hesitant either. Just final. The dull thump of boxes being lifted, something small clattering to the floor, maybe a bottle, a rattle, a memory. The kind of sounds that once would have drawn me out in concern. But not now. Now, they were just echoes. Noise that would fade as soon as she closed the door again. She didn't call out to me. Didn't peek her head in the workshop. Didn't try to say anything else. And still, I felt her presence in every corner of the house as she moved, like the ghost of a song I used to hum, familiar and distant, meaningless now without its lyrics. Through the thin wall, I heard the shuffle of her bag against the hallway table. I'd already packed most of her things, her clothes, the baby monitor, the half-finished scrapbook with a single sonogram photo taped to the front. I didn't do it to be cold. I did it to be clear, to make it easier. For both of us. She lingered longer in the room she used to sleep in. I could hear it. The drag of her steps across the floor, the long pause before she picked up the last box. Maybe she was remembering something. Maybe she was trying to. I don't know. I didn't ask. I didn't go see. That door, just like the one between us, stayed closed. When she finally left, I didn't hear the front door slam. It closed gently, like even she understood that this wasn't the place for loud exits anymore. I waited a minute. Then another. Then silence. True silence. The kind that didn't hurt anymore. The kind that didn't ask questions or beg for more. Eventually, I stepped out of the workshop and walked through the house. Everything was in place. The floors clean, the kitchen quiet, her room stripped of the personal touches that once made it feel like hers. No more diaper boxes. No more chipped mugs by the sink. No more tension hiding under every corner of the roof I'd paid for with more than money. I stepped into her old room. The air still held her scent, faint floral soap, formula, something sweet and ghost-like. The bed was bare. The dresser drawers open. The curtains drawn halfway. On the windowsill sat one thing she hadn't taken, a small wooden duck I carved when she was 6, part of a birthday project that never quite got finished. It used to sit on her childhood shelf, always tilted just slightly forward, like it wanted to fly but didn't know how. I picked it up, turned it in my hand, felt the worn grooves I once shaped with care. For a moment, I almost smiled. Then I set it back down. Some things are meant to stay behind. I didn't mourn her departure. Not this time. There were no tears, no gut punches, no wondering what I could have done differently. I had done everything a father could do, and then some. And now I had nothing left to give. Nothing left I was willing to sacrifice just to be tolerated. I walked back into the workshop and picked up the cradle again. It was nearly finished now, smooth, sturdy, every joint fitted with precision. I wasn't building it for Elise anymore. I wasn't building it for Alyssa. I was building it for the man I used to be. For the man who still believed in creating something beautiful even when no one asked for it. That cradle, like this house, had become a monument, not to pain, but to healing. I turned on the radio, an old one with a dial that sometimes crackled when you adjusted it. Soft jazz filled the room, weaving into the air like a balm. I worked for hours, sanding, sealing, polishing. The wood caught the light from the window just right, glowing with that quiet kind of pride only handmade things possess. By the time evening arrived, the house felt full again, not of people, but of presence. Mine. I made dinner, just for myself. Ate it at the table without checking my phone. Washed the dish and put it away. Then I stood at the door one last time, opened it, and stared out into the yard. The street was still. The sky a soft lavender blue. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like someone might show up needing me to bend. I didn't feel like a man waiting for his daughter to remember who he was. I was just here, in my house, breathing air that no longer carried the weight of being overlooked. And that door? It stayed closed. Not because I was angry, because I was free. She never said goodbye. I didn't expect her to. That part of our story had ended long before the final box left the threshold. Some people think closure is a conversation, a scene where someone finally says, "I'm sorry," or "thank you," or even "I was wrong." But I've learned that sometimes closure is just the absence of noise, a door that stays shut, a breath that no longer catches when you think about what could have been. After she left, the days didn't come in heavy. They came in slow and steady, like water smoothing stone. I found myself waking up early, not from anxiety or duty, but from habit. I'd open the curtains, let the light warm the walls she used to lean against, and walk room to room with a cup of coffee in hand, reclaiming the quiet like a man who finally understands the value of his own space. The nursery, now bare, didn't ache anymore. The pink curtains she had picked were gone. The walls were a soft white again, 2 coats of paint I rolled on with no music, no help, just me and the rhythm of repetition. There were no toys left, no baby lotion scent hanging in the air. It had become something else, a room unclaimed, waiting for new purpose. Not a wound, not a shrine, just a room. The cradle stood in the corner of the workshop, finished, polished, smooth like river stones worn down by time. I had worked on it with the care of someone who knew he wouldn't see it filled, not with a child, at least, but with meaning. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever made. I didn't build it to give away anymore. I built it because I could, because I wanted to. Because there was still a part of me that believed in the quiet power of building something that no one else needed to understand. Sometimes I sat beside it, just sat, no tools in hand, no plan in mind. I traced the carved edges with my fingers, letting the wood speak its language, soft, sure, unfinished in the best way. I didn't fantasize about Elise rocking in it anymore. I didn't cling to the image of being the kind of grandfather who told bedtime stories and wiped strained peas from a baby's chin. That version of the future was gone, and I had let it go without rage. That was the real miracle. Not that I had survived the pain, but that I had walked through it without becoming bitter. The house stayed clean now, not because I expected company, but because it gave me peace. I found comfort in wiping down the counters each morning, in folding the dish towel just so, in turning off every light before bed like a ritual. There was no one leaving shoes by the door, no clattering footsteps on the stairs, no crying baby monitor in the night. And still, it didn't feel empty. It felt mine. I filled the silence with small joys. A new jazz record, a pot of soup that simmered all day while I read the old novels I'd once put off. I repaired the leaky faucet in the bathroom, not because it bothered anyone, but because I could. I put a rocking chair on the porch, painted it blue, sat there in the evenings, and listened to the wind move through the trees like a voice that no longer needed to shout to be heard. Every now and then, neighbors would wave. A few asked about Alyssa. I'd nod politely, say she was doing fine. I didn't elaborate. I didn't lie. I simply didn't open that chapter again. It didn't belong to me anymore. Some people leave, and the healthiest thing you can do is stop leaving the door cracked open for them to return. I didn't check social media. I didn't ask mutual friends what she was doing, where she had gone, who she was leaning on now. I let her have her story, and I held on to mine, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because one of the hardest truths I've come to accept is that love does not always circle back. Sometimes it gets off at a different stop, builds a new life, and forgets to send you the forwarding address. But I still loved her. I always will. Just differently now. Quietly. From a distance that doesn't shrink. On one particular evening, I found myself walking through the house with the lights off. The kind of soft dusk where everything looks more like memory than matter. I passed her old room, then the nursery, then back into the hallway where her baby pictures still hung. I didn't take them down. Not out of reluctance, but because they told a story that was still mine. Her laughter at 2 years old, cheeks round and dimpled. Her Halloween costume at 5, dressed as a bumblebee, wings askew. Those moments weren't erased by the distance. They were just closed books on the shelf, dusty maybe, but intact. I ended the night in the workshop. The cradle sat exactly where I left it, sunlight sliding across the varnished rail like a quiet blessing. I didn't need to rock it. I didn't need to finish it anymore. It was already whole, just like me. I didn't know if Elise would ever know me. Maybe she'd grow up hearing stories that painted me gray, distant, difficult. Maybe she'd never ask about the man who built her a cradle with hands she never saw. And if that's the case, then so be it. I can't control the stories other people tell. But I know my truth. I mattered. Even if she never knows my name. Even if Alyssa never says thank you. Even if I'm just a line in their version of events. I mattered in the quiet. I mattered in the showing up. I mattered in the building. And that cradle, finished, smooth, untouched, was my proof. I live in a house that is finally mine. A house not weighed down by the hopes of someone else's recognition. A house filled with the kind of silence that doesn't ask me to shrink to fit inside it. And for once, when I say yes, it's to myself. To the morning coffee brewed without obligation. To the breeze through the window that reminds me I am still here. To the man I see in the mirror, weathered, sure, and finally whole. I said yes. To peace. To boundaries. To healing. And that's a story no one else gets to rewrite.